A nation suddenly runs out of foreign currency. Without dollars or euros to buy imported food, secure fuel, or service its external debts, the entire economic engine shuts down. This is a balance of payments crisis. In steps the International Monetary Fund with a multi-billion-dollar lifeline. The cash comes with a catch, a highly specific, non-negotiable document known as a letter of intent. This document is designed to mitigate moral hazard, the risk that providing a financial safety net encourages a country to continue reckless spending. Under the liberal economic view, the IMF operates as a shared credit cooperative. Policy conditions are attached to ensure borrowing countries actually fix their broken economies, rather than just buying time with someone else's money. The moment a finance minister signs that letter, they make a stark trade. They secure immediate financial survival, but they surrender a significant portion of their domestic economic sovereignty to an external creditor. Strict policy conditionality was not part of the original 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. In fact, John Maynard Keynes explicitly warned against allowing the new institution to exert what he called a grandmotherly control over the domestic policies of its sovereign member states. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the United States stood as the primary global creditor. To safeguard its own capital from default, the U.S. successfully pushed to formalize these strict policy conditions. This policy shift ended the IMF's role as a passive emergency fund. The institution began setting the internal economic priorities for member states worldwide. This line graph tracks the average number of IMF conditions attached to a single loan. Through the 1970s, it hovers around 6 basic macroeconomic targets. As the 1980s debt crisis hits, the focus shifts to deep, invasive structural conditions, and that average explodes to over 50. These new requirements formed the Washington Consensus. This standard package of liberal reforms was applied heavily to developing nations, mandating strict fiscal austerity, the rapid privatization of state-owned enterprises, and total trade liberalization. Look at point number 2 on this document, redirecting public expenditure away from indiscriminate subsidies. In Sub-Saharan Africa, this specific rule required governments to completely remove financial support and subsidies for local agriculture. Marxist economists argue that forcing the removal of these agricultural subsidies devastated local farming. It triggered severe food shortages and contributed to a lost decade of stagnant growth across the continent. The IMF maintained it was simply imposing necessary fiscal discipline. Critics saw an institution transferring the painful burden of debt adjustment directly onto the world's poorest citizens. This bar chart tracks the average number of structural conditions per IMF program year. Notice the massive vertical spike right here in 1997, marking the historical peak of structural conditionality during the Asian financial crisis. During this period, the IMF attached 94 separate structural conditions to its bailout of South Korea and 140 to Indonesia. These requirements were explicitly designed to dismantle the state-led industrial policies that those nations had used to grow. Economist Joseph Stiglitz argued the IMF misdiagnosed the disease. These economies were hit by a sudden, devastating panic of private capital flight, but the IMF treated them as if they suffered from bloated, irresponsible public spending. By forcing governments to cut spending exactly when their shrinking economies needed a stimulus, the prescribed austerity was pro-cyclical. It guaranteed the resulting recessions would be much deeper and more destructive. The crisis sparked a fierce global backlash. Protesters viewed the IMF as a mechanism for structural overhaul, using the financial emergency to dismantle the state-led industrial model and open local markets for foreign capital. Fast forward to the 2010 Eurozone crisis. The IMF joined forces with the European Commission and the European Central Bank to form the Troika to bail out Greece. Standard IMF procedure requires private creditors to accept losses on unsustainable debt before a bailout begins. In the Greek case, the fund bypassed this requirement, providing record-breaking financing while leaving the existing debt levels untouched. The motive behind bending the rules was political. Restructuring Greek debt would have inflicted steep losses on the heavily exposed French and German banks holding those bonds, risking the financial contagion across the entire Eurozone. The resulting austerity measures shrank the Greek GDP by 25%. even within advanced European economies, the protection of wealthy foreign creditors superseded the economic health of the borrowing nation. In the wake of the 1990s, the IMF did attempt reforms. Their 2002 guidelines aimed to streamline conditions and promote country ownership, ensuring borrowing nations felt they were driving their own recovery programs. Contrasting those stated goals with the reality of the Greek crisis leaves a lingering question. Did the underlying logic of austerity ever actually shift? This animated chart breaks down IMF voting power. The institution abandons the one country, one vote principle. Instead, power is tied directly to financial contributions. The United States holds over a 16% share, granting it a de facto veto over any major decisions, which require an 85% supermajority. This structure creates a democratic deficit. Conditionality agreements are negotiated in private by unelected technocrats, completely bypassing the borrowing nation's parliament and voting public. The enduring liberal defense is that strict conditionality, while painful, is the only way to enforce necessary economic discipline, correct market distortions, and protect the global financial system from total collapse. The Statist and Marxist counterargument views it as an instrument of structural coercion, stripping developing nations of their sovereign right to choose their own economic destiny. When a finance minister signs a letter of intent in the midnight hour of a crisis, who is actually dictating their future? Their own elected leaders or the architects of global capital?